Okay, let's get started. So I'm Stath Vaille, I'm an FC for Brave. If you
Jump
guys haven't met me before, I'm going to do a quick class on combat probing. So hopefully this will be about 30 minutes plus a little bit of time for questions based on how things go. So combat probing is the concept of probing down enemy ships so that you can walk to them at zero, which is incredibly useful for many aspects of PvP in EVE. It's very similar in mechanics to the PvE combat probing or the PvE exploration probing. So if you've ever done any exploration and you've got some experience with kind of moving the probes around, that's massively helpful for combat probing in EVE. So first thing I want to talk about is why bother combat probing? Like, when is it useful? What's the point of it? If you ever FC a fleet, you pretty much need to have combat probes on your ship, with very few exceptions. So if you guys are looking to do some FC, which I highly recommend you all do, letting out a combat probe is really useful. Combat probes are super useful for a FC because they allow you to position your fleet at the range of the enemy fleet that you want. Normally, in a fleet fight, both FCs will have combat probes, so you kind of have to move around each other, and if you don't have combat probes and enemy FC does, gives them a huge advantage over you. So being able to combat probe, super useful. That being said, it isn't only useful for FCs, it's also useful in lots of other situations. So for example, in a standing fleet, it's very common that bad guys will come in the system and they'll bounce around, they'll disappear, or they'll maybe just be off a gate 500 kilometers away. If you can combat probe them down, super useful to be able to catch them in ways you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. In recent years, combat probing has also become really useful in Rorke saves. So what normally happens in a Rorke save, if you guys haven't been involved in them, is Rorks will get tackled by an enemy fleet. We jump in, overwhelming force, and they run away. And then we get dictators to bubble gates so they can't really escape. So normally they'll come in through a wormhole, and they'll want to escape through that same wormhole. If we've scanned down that wormhole and we can have dictators waiting on it ahead of time, that's awesome. That forces them to stay in system and bounce around and try and safe log. The more people we have with combat probes out in space scanning them down, the easier it is to catch them and the more pressure it puts on them. It really kind of punishes an enemy fleet for trying to tackle Rorquals, and it means you can get some real juicy kills because of it. So for those reasons, I'd highly recommend everyone has at least a little bit of experience combat probing. With the introduction of the T3 destroyer, they have a 90% reduction in the fitting penalties to combat probers. So you can fly a really effective PvP ship which also has combat probes, which is just ridiculously useful. Any kind of Rorke save, particularly if you come to it late, if we already have the grid secure, if you came down in a probing ship rather than coming down in a Harpy, you'd be massively useful. And even in big Strelok fleets, so the really big complicated Strelok fleets with 1,000 people aside, normally in those you've got the main DPS fleets battling it out, but there's people hopping around all over the place, there's safe spots to the sun. If you can combat probe and tackle some of those guys, call it out to the FC, you can get some real nice kills that way. So, any questions before I move on about why it's worth combat probing? Okay, next thing I want to talk about is ships. So you've kind of got three options for ships. You can fly bonus ships bonus for combat probing. So these are normally the exploration ships, the Strelios, Astera, that kind of thing. These are pretty good because you get the bonuses, which makes your scan probes very strong. The downside of those ships though is you're very weak in them. They're not PvP ships, they're not combat ships. You're pretty squishy. I tend to not use them very often at all. I would recommend they're really useful in a Rorke save situation where we already have the fleet or the system secure, so you don't need to do any PvPing. It just gives you that little edge for probing faster, makes you a little stronger, which is useful. Or if you have really weak skills, that might be worth doing. Second class of ships, as I already mentioned, the T3 destroyers. These are super great because you're a PvP ship. You can tackle things, you can survive, you're super powerful in them. The third is kind of the FC boat. So if you're FCing a big ship, normally what you'll do is you'll fit a tankier equivalent of the main DPS fleet. So for a mower, for example, you may just take some of the mag stabs off, put on a probe launcher, swap out some tank, and you probe from that. It gives you the advantage of you are going the same speed as the main fleet, and you can still receive logi reps and all those good things. So for FCing, I tend to do some variation of the main DPS with probe launchers, but pretty much always probe launchers in every scenario. So, you've got your ship, you understand why you want to probe launch, the next thing you need to worry about is skills. So surprisingly for combat probing, you don't need that good skills, you only need very weak skills. I think I had level 3 skills for like the longest time, and I was combat probing all the time. Obviously the better they are, the more likely you are to scan down enemy ships. So some things are harder to scan down than others based on their sensor strength. Interceptors, for example, incredibly hard to scan down. People used to do things with T3 cruisers, which made them incredibly hard to scan down. Or there's a concept of like the unprobable ship. A few years ago, after some changes to mechanics and balance, there's no such thing as a completely unprobable ship. Now, if you have perfect skills and you have about 2 billion of implants in your head, you can scan down anything. But in most situations, that's not really what you need to be worried about. Normally, any kind of fleet fight, you've always got a cruiser there, you've always got someone who's got the micro warp drive on. You only need one person in an enemy fleet to have to be probable, and you can warp on the whole fleet. It is nice to be able to get interceptors, particularly when they're kind of dotted around the side of fleets, but if you can't get them, that's fine. I wouldn't stress too much about skills. Implants as well, you can get implants that improve your scanning strength. Again, I don't think they're worth it, I don't think they're worth the money, you don't really need them. I would say just get started with whatever you've got. The skills improve your scan strength, so how likely you are to get 100% lock on someone. Your scan time, so how quickly it takes your probes to cycle. This is really good if you're trying to get people very quickly. And finally, the scan deviation. The scan deviation is how, when you see the little dots on your screen, how close they're going to be and how far, like how much error they'll have in them. For combat probing, that's actually not that useful. That's really useful for exploration, but most combat probing, you're scanning a grid where you already know where the enemy are in most cases. So that's not actually that useful. Okay, so I talked about skills, I've talked about reasons to probe, and I've talked about ships. Next thing I want to talk about is the actual mechanics. So if you guys are in a ship right now, please undock, that'll make it easier. First thing you need to do is fit an expanded probe launcher to your ship. So this is the type of probe launcher that can fit combat probes. These can also fit core probes, which are used for exploration, but aren't quite as good for it. So I would only fit an expanded probe launcher if you're actually combat probing. The fitting restrictions on them are a lot harder, which makes them not as useful for everyday use. There are 3 types of expanded probe launchers. There's the standard Tech 1-1, which is what I use in most cases. It's super cheap, it's easy to fit, it's pretty great. There's the Tech 2-1, which is slightly harder to fit but slightly stronger. These are good if you've got the skills and you've got the extra fitting. The third one is the Sisters one. This is about 30 million-ish each a module. It is easier to fit than the Tech 1 and is stronger than the Tech 1. So if you've got a lot of money, that's the one to go for. Personally, I tend never to use Sisters. It's very rare I use a Sisters probe launcher. Maybe if I'm flying a really expensive ship. Simply because I don't think the extra strength it gives you is worth the ISK, and I'm a cheapskate. The next thing to worry about after the probe launcher, remember expanded probe launcher, not core probe launcher, is the probes. So the probes themselves are combat scanning probes as opposed to core scanning probes. You can actually scan down anomalies and whatnot with combat scanning probes, but you can't reduce their radius as far. You can only reduce them to a minimum of 0.5 AU rather than 0.25 AU with the cores. So if you're doing exploration, bring core probes. If you're doing combat probing, bring combat probes. So there's also 2 types of probes. There's the Tech 1 ones and there are Sisters ones, the faction ones. I pretty much always use the Sisters ones. It's about 8 million for a flight of 8. You need 8 or it doesn't work. I think that's totally worth the money. The extra strength you get from them versus the money makes it worthwhile. The other thing you can do as well is bring a second set of probes for your cargo bay. The reason this is useful is when you first launch your probes, you have to recall them and reload them. But if you have a second set sat in your cargo bay, they automatically reload. This means if you're moving between systems or having to drop cold probes and drop them out for whatever reason, you've already got another set loaded. For combat situations, that can be quite important for getting the probe out quickly. Okay, so you're setting your ship, you've got your right modules. Now I want to talk about when to probe. So if you're probing people, the best thing to do is kind of know where they are ahead of time. So in any kind of fleet fight situation, you can normally either engineer a fight to happen on a gate, for example, or you already know where it's going to happen because you're fighting in some kind of timer, some kind of like structure timer, where you know what grid you're going to be fighting on. For that reason, combat probing isn't about doing a big 8AU scan of the whole system and then narrowing in. It's about putting your probes exactly where you want them ahead of time and then scanning people down. The other super useful thing to do is to use filtering to, before you even start worrying about the enemy fleet, remove your friendly fleet. So right now I'm sat on a keep start with a couple of friendlies, so I know me and this smallest bro sat next to me aren't going to be the people I want to probe down to. So the first thing I'm going to do is launch my probe, then press F9. This brings up the solar system window. Now you can do this full screen, you can do this windowed. Personally I like to do it windowed. I like to be able to just see a little bit of my overview and kind of move it around as needed when I see what's going on. If you look on this window with the F10, if you zoom in, you'll see a little symbol somewhere, I can't see it online, which has got a little crosshair over it, which is where your current little system with your crosshair in it, and that might not be what your camera's currently zoomed around. So once you find that, if you double click in it, it recenters your camera. And now this is one of the tricks to combat probing. Double clicking on what you're looking at allows you to rotate your camera around that point. If you're trying to rotate around a point other than what you've double clicked, what you've got focused, the camera does really stupid things. It's really hard to do. So first thing to do is find you. You've also got the option of the probe scanner window with the probe scanner results. So that could be docked to the side of this F9 window when you first open it. Personally, I like to extract that and just put it on my main screen as a separate window. So down on my bottom right, I have that window there. So next thing you want to do is, in the right hand side of that, there is the filter window. And the new one of these has lots of preset filters. So I'm scanning for ships, so I'm going to deselect anomalies and cosmic signatures and just have ships left. That means that a lot of the noise in that window is gone. And a lot of the trick to combat probing really is to minimize the noise to make it so that that window is as small as possible. So next thing I want to do is launch my probes, get them out in space, and then you'll see there's a big blue kind of, it's 8 spheres all over each other in a shape. If you set the formation at the bottom of your probe window to pinpoint formation, and that's where your probes are currently scanning when you press scan. You now need to move that over to your own ship so you can scan that. So I'm going to talk about what this thing actually looks like for a second, because it's a bit weird. So you've got a cube in the middle, and you've got arrows coming off at each of the faces of this cube, and then you've got some blue spheres around that. The blue spheres are showing you the shape and the size of the area you're going to scan. The area where they overlap, where all spheres overlap in the middle, is ideally where you want the bad guys to be. The more spheres you have overlapping, the better the scan result you're going to get. In terms of moving this thing around, you've got two options. You can either drag the arrow, which will move it in one dimension, so up or down, left, right, forward, backwards. I personally never use the arrow. What I do is I use the face. I use one of the faces of the cubes.
Attention.
So let's say I want to move my probes from where they are now to where I am. I'll pick a direction, so one side of the cube. So right now I'm going to look directly down on that cube. I then select the face of that cube and then drag it. So right now I can drag that in 2 dimensions. I can drag it in the 2 dimensions of the flat plane that cube moves on, which means I can move my probes around a lot more quicker. So I look at that one direction, pick the cube, drag it over where I want. As soon as I finish dragging it, I need to double click it. That recenters my camera on it and allows me to pivot my camera. Now I'm going to pivot my camera 90 degrees and get one of the other sides of the cube. Again, I can now click that, move it in 2 dimensions, pull it directly over myself. If you're lucky, you can do that in 2 goes. Spin your camera around and you should ideally have the center of the cube directly on the thing you want to scan, which is in this case me. Once you've done that, you click the Analyze button and you wait a few seconds. So 2 things are happening when you click the Analyze button. The first thing is the probes are moving from where they were launched to where you're about to scan. If they're already in that position, they don't need to move, which is great. But if you're moving them maybe 100 AU, that takes a few seconds. The second thing that happens is the probe cycle time runs. Depending on your skills, that takes maybe about 7 seconds. At that point, you complete and you'll see your scan results down in your probe scanner window. So anything big, like a Leviathan for example, I've scanned in 1 cycle. Some other ships like this Nereus here, I haven't scanned. And in fact, the Nereus isn't even that small, right? But I wasn't able to get 100% scan on them. So anything big, I'll be able to right click and warp to. If it's 100%, if it's less than 100%, I may get what the ship's name is or the ship's type is. You also get this ID here. I'll talk a little bit more about the IDs in a little bit because they're sometimes useful if there's multiple people probing. But next thing to do is get the 100% scan on this. So you'll see there's some little red dots here. So these are where it thinks some of these different ships are. Again, the scan deviation skill affects how far off the red dots are from the actual location of those ships. But for combat probing, it doesn't matter. I know what grid I'm scanning. I know I'm scanning this Keepstar grid, so that I can ignore the red dots. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove my probes directly on top again, and reduce my probe size from 4 AU to 0.5 AU. If I scan again now with smaller AUs, this should hopefully get me more ships. Okay, so I've got almost everything. The only one I didn't get there was a Maulus. So a Maulus at the a Maulus is a frigate, relatively small, doesn't have his MDAD on. I only got that down to 77%. So with the pinpoint formation at minimum speed, I've got a lot of ships, but not everything. There's actually a trick you can do here to get this even better, which a lot of people I think don't realise. So if you were to hold control, you'll see that an extra weird window appears where you can move all these probes independently. So if you click control, grab one of the arrows and drag it in, I can now create a super tight formation where the probes are nearly on top of each other. Now what you don't want to do is make them exactly on top of each other. If they're exactly on top of each other, it doesn't seem to work as well. You kind of want them nearly on top of each other. From that position, you can reanalyze, and it would hopefully be enough to get me a few extra percentage on this Maulus. Okay, so I just jumped from 77% on that Maulus to 90%. So right now in this formation it's not quite enough to get him, but depending on his size, for example, that just gives you an extra edge on the combat probing. Now interestingly, this tiny formation we've got here, if I jiggled it about a little bit more, maybe brought them in, brought them out, I'd get slightly different percentages. I might increase or decrease my reliability. So I'm going to bring them in a little bit and see if that helps. So I'm going from a 90.6%. I'm going to do a rescan now with them slightly closer in, and this might be slightly better. Okay, I went up to 91%, so I'm probably not going to get this Maulus, but I got pretty close. If you tweak around with this for a little bit, trying to scan in unscannable ships or very hard to scan ships, until you get it just absolutely perfect, the next cool thing you can do is save that formation. So there's this little, next to the 3 formation buttons at the bottom left of the probe scanner, there's this saved formation button. You can create a new saved formation, put a name in it, and save it there. Now I've actually got 3 pre-saved, which are my combat probing anomalies, combat probing formations that I've used previously. And these are what I think is about optimal in the formation. This means when you're combat probing, rather than dragging to 0.5 AU, you just click that formation, drop it down to minimum size, and it automatically puts them right on top of each other.
Enemy 5 jumps.
It's quite a useful technique for when you're moving quickly in space, trying to combat probe fast. Okay, so that was quite a difficult thing to explain just over voice. I hope you guys were following along and could get what I was saying there. Does anybody have any questions about that? Was that not clear to anybody?
I'm sorry, I just joined in. Is this an exploration
This
class?
is about combat probing.
Alright, do you mind if
Absolutely,
I listen in?
buddy. Join along. There is a fleet up, feel free to join. There are... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm in an exploration ship, but I'm willing to learn about
Yep,
probing.
exact same idea. The only difference between an exploration probing and combat probing is the type of probe launcher and the type of probe you use. So if you use an expanded probe launcher and you use a combat probe, it's the same concept. Okay, so now we've done some scanning, we've got some things scanned down. What I normally do in this situation is if I'm in a fleet fight and I know I'm going to need to probe down some bad guys, first thing I want to do is find a good opportunity where our friendly fleet are all on a grid, ideally on a grid without the bad guys. So for example, if we're forming up on a Keepstar, we know we're going to fight in their system. This is a good opportunity to filter out friendlies. So I normally have my probe launcher results ordered by distance, so the closest things to me are at the top and the furthest things are at the bottom. This is useful because anything you haven't probed down fully has an artificially large distance on it based on that scan deviation. So this mauler says it's 169,000 kilometers away from me. This means that the ones I'm looking at the top of the grid are ones that I've scanned down 100%. It also means probably, in most situations, my friendly fleet is closer to me than the enemy fleet is. So let's say I want to ignore this Leviathan because he's getting in the way. You can right click him on the results, click ignore result. So that means now, for the duration I'm in the system and I hadn't changed session, so I haven't docked up and undocked, that Leviathan is ignored from my results. If you go to the top right, there's an ignore thing and you can kind of clear him off and bring him back if you do something by error. But what I would normally want to do is ignore all the friendlies and just add the bad guys in. Makes it a lot quicker when you're trying to very quickly do combat probing if everything on the grid is things you want. Other things you can do, which is useful for kind of niches, is earlier when we took off ships and we took off anomalies and cosmic signatures, I can actually create a custom filter here. So let's say I only wanted to shoot, I only wanted to probe down Logi, for example. So you would open that up, you'd go to ships, and this is just like in your overview when you're adding new ships there. I can create Logis, I can give it a new filter name called Logi, save that, and now I've got a new filter here, Logi, which only shows me Logi ships. That's obviously quite useful if you're doing things like rush cats. So if you're doing ECM burst interceptors and you're probing people onto enemy lodges, I don't care about all the other ships on grid, just show me the lodges. It's a little more niche, but it's a nice thing to know. Okay, so we've scanned down our friendly ship, we have ignored hostile results, and we need to, there's a retribution here, let's see if we can get this retribution. So this is kind of cool because I already have my probe set up in space looking at this guy. So if I ignore all results, probes are already set up in space. You see I got that retribution scanned down first time. So if I were to right click warp to, I'd be able to warp my fleet directly on him. Now, this is also a good thing to know here about when this is and isn't useful. So right now I don't have any PvP guys with me, I don't have any guns on my ship, so I'm not going to warp to him because he'll kill me. But right now that guy's moving at 0 velocity, which means that if I were to warp to him, or warp a fleet to him, I'd land directly on him. Combat probing is super useful for getting on enemies who are a long way away if they aren't moving very fast. For example, if they just exited warp or if they're bad. If this retribution was going at full speed, so he was running 3,500 kilometers a second, that would be actually really hard to probe down. It takes you a minimum of about 7 or 8 seconds from, even if you're perfectly aligned towards him, from entering warp and exiting warp before you can target him. So if you think about that, from the moment I click warp to the moment I've landed and ready to go, if he's got 7 seconds to burn away and he's going at 3,500 kilometers a second, he's burnt a long way away from where we're going to land to him. Combat probing is only useful if the fleet isn't going particularly fast, so if you can kind of probe ahead of them. You don't want to necessarily probe to where they've been because that just puts you in range of their optimal and you're in a bad position. You'll see a lot of kind of junior FCs doing this. They'll probe down enemies, warp to them, the enemies will kite them off, they'll start shooting at them, and they're already in position at that point when the friendly fleet exits warp. So knowing when combat probes are useful is obviously helpful for staying alive. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is sorry, before I move on, does anyone have any questions about that? I appreciate this is quite a difficult thing to explain over comms, so this may be a bit easier if you watch the video later. There are some hotkeys you can set up to increase and decrease your probe size. You can also use a hotkey to scan. What I would normally do when I'm in a fleet is I set my probes up on the grid and I'm just constantly cycling them, just waiting for new guys to come in, because it gives you time to tidy them up. If new friendlies join the fleet, which normally happens, people dock up or undock, you'll see that you'll keep getting things back in and back out. So constantly updating that probe window and closing them down is a really nice way of keeping things tidy. So the other thing I want to talk about, like I mentioned earlier, was what we do with these IDs. So each ID here is the ID of a specific ship in space for the duration that the ship is in the system. So if a ship leaves and comes back, that ID will change. But while they're here, that ID is always going to be the same. So let's say, for example, I've scanned down this Retribution. I can tell you that the Retribution has the ID of JKP. That ID is the same for everyone else in system. So if you've got multiple combat probers combat probing together, this is a neat way of sharing intel about who's who. A few weeks ago we had a rock save from a Bombers Bar fleet that came into Impasse, and they'd blopped a Redeemer in, and they were trying to exfil, they were trying to get their guys onto the blops and escape. What we were able to do, because we got a lucky probe in on him, we were able to tell what his ID was, what his tag was. And all the combat probers in system had basically ignored everything but that tag, which meant that when he decloaked, it was very easy. Rather than having 50 bombers and one Redeemer in there, we just had the single Redeemer. It makes combat probing a hell of a lot easier. Also means that you can maybe get one good probe on someone getting close at one point, and then later on, because the ID stays the same, as they move around system, you may know what the ships are later on through the kind of the name of the group that's pre-scanned down for that ID, even if your subsequent scans are weaker. Okay, that is pretty much the basics of combat probing. Things to practice are normally when you're in a fleet, for example, you'll jump into a system and you'll warp to an enemy fleet. You want probes on the enemy fleet before your fleet lands. As soon as your fleet lands, you want to be anchoring up, you want to be looking at where they're warping, you want to be calling targets. So a cool thing to practice is as you're warping from one gate to another gate, as you exit warp from the as you enter warp from the first gate, just before as you're aligning, if you drop probes, it's a really cool thing to practice trying to set up probes on your out gate and cycle them so that once you exit, you've already got the probes set up and ready to go. So as we're warping from one gate to another, you drop probes, move them into position, set the size and the shape down to minimal, and click scan. Now this is super cool if you couple this with the ability to warp to attack. So if you have a tactical on your out gate, and you know the hostile fleet is on the out gate because your scouts told you this, if you jump into a system, probe them down while in warp to attack, you can immediately call your fleet to align to the enemies on land. So the moment you exit warp, your fleets are lining up, your cycle ends, and you can immediately warp to the hostiles. Really good for kind of catching people unawares, because hostile fleets don't normally expect you to be able to do that so quickly. It's just a matter of practicing this window of moving the probes around, getting the size small, and putting them over where you think the enemy are. Coordinating with scouts is useful for this as well. If you have friendly scouts who can bounce around planets, give you D-scans. If you don't know exactly where the enemy are, you can increase your scan strength to something a little higher. 4 AU's good, 8 AU's okay, 16 is really not going to get anything of use. So if it's a big system like LTEC 5 is, it's hard to just scan people in arbitrary safes. If it's a smaller system, it's more feasible to be able to do. If people can give you approximate D-scans, like it's within 1 AU of Planet 5, obviously you move your probes over to Planet 5, put them on a 1 AU scan, and you increase the likelihood of trying to get them. But having people relay to you via D-scan where they think enemies are makes it possible to scan guys down who are in safes. I think a lot of people do, because I think they think it's safe, is they'll warp to what used to be off-grid techs on gates, so they'll warp maybe like 500,000 kilometers from a gate. 500,000 kilometers is still within a short probe scan window, so you can probe people down who are on grid with you, but are still in that probe window. Annoyingly, you don't know where they are, so if you warp a fleet to them, you normally have to do a cold warp, but you still catch people unawares quite a bit. Okay, that is basically everything I wanted to say about combat probing. Does anybody have any questions? You guys are also quiet!
I guess we're just trying to take all the information in.
Yeah, a little difficult thing.
Very helpful.
Thank you so much. Please feel free to IM me if you have any questions about this. Like I say, it'll probably be easier to see on the video, so please check that out when it goes up. Guys, thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you, Stath. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Enemy
Thank
5
you.
jump